Every city hides a dark secret. Beneath the subway lines you ride, there is a sealed, hidden network. I just breached the zero line, a forbidden tunnel locked since 1892 when a construction crew vanished. Reports blamed gas, but classified records claim they dug into something ancient, something that refused to be disturbed. I'm standing on those tracks now. The air is freezing, walls echo with terrifying scraping metal sounds. If you hear a faint train whistle behind you, do not turn around. The zero line hunts new passengers. I found the entrance behind a rusted hatch in the Northern Line's darkest corner. Thousands pass, never noticing the smell. The door wasn't locked. It was sealed with lead, stamped with a grotesque symbol, a screaming mouth, I forced it open. Stale air rushed out, entombed since the dark Victorian era. My flashlight barely cut through the heavy dust. The zero-line tunnels looked nothing like modern subways. Walls of dark, decaying brick sweated oily black moisture. No electric cables existed down here. Rusted brass brackets held ancient dead gas lamps. But the most terrifying part was the absolute silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was a heavy, pressurized dead zone that made my eardrums throb. I followed the dead tracks. The thin, heavily rusted rails looked more like skeletal remains than transit infrastructure. After 20 agonizing minutes, I reached a station. It doesn't exist on any map. A rotting wooden sign hung from the ceiling. Street Jude's for the silent. No benches, no ticket booths. Just an empty platform, completely crowded with thousands of old-fashioned Victorian gramophones. Their brass horns pointed at the rails. I approached one. It was pristine, brass, gleaming like polished an hour ago. The black wax cylinder was spinning. I leaned toward the horn. I didn't hear music. I heard a wet, heavy, rhythmic thumping like a massive heart. Suddenly, every single gramophone on the platform shifted. 1,000 brass horns rotated in perfect unison, tracking my movement. I completely froze. My flashlight hit the tunnel opening, marked by a carved sign, Vestibule of Breath. From the blackness, I heard a distant sound. A train whistle, like a human scream forced through metal. I stared down at the tracks. They were violently vibrating. Small rocks danced across the rotting wooden ties. Something was coming. I spun around to run, but my exit door was completely gone, replaced by a solid, towering wall of brass gramophones, their horns now vibrating with a deep, guttural growl. "Who's there?" I yelled. The gramophones caught my words and instantly broadcasted them back, heavily distorted. My own terrified voice sounding 100 years old. The tunnel light rapidly grew, brighter, violently flickering, sickly orange glow. This was no modern electric headlight. It was a massive, roaring open furnace leading an ancient, nightmarish iron locomotive. As it screeched into the dead station, I realized this train wasn't built from metal alone. The massive boiler was tightly wrapped in thick, black leather that visibly pulsed like human skin. The carriage windows were heavily frosted over, revealing dark silhouettes of trapped passengers inside. They were all sitting perfectly, unnaturally still, hands locked in their laps. The train halted with a loud hiss of black, rotting steam. The nearest carriage door slowly slid open. A tall figure stepped out. He wore a conductor's uniform from the late 1800s, but his face was pure nightmare. His decaying skin matched old newspaper, and his mouth was violently stitched shut with thick, rusted copper wire. In his jerky hands, he offered a silver tray holding a single black wax cylinder. "Ticket, please." The horrific conductor never moved his sewn lips. Instead, the 1,000 brass gramophones on the platform spoke for him. Every horn roared at once. unleashing a deafening, surround sound voice that violently shook the tunnel's foundation. I quickly backed away, but he stepped closer, his movements terrifyingly jerky and mechanical. "The zero line requires a blood recording. Give us your voice, and you may pass." I suddenly saw Jackson's pale face in a frosted train window. My best friend who vanished 3 years ago. He sat in the third carriage, his eyes terrifyingly vacant, a thick brass tube painfully connecting his throat to the wall. He wasn't a passenger, he was the fuel. The zero line doesn't run on burning coal. It runs on the eternal screams of the lost. The conductor blindly reached for my throat. I violently swung my heavy flashlight, smashing the conductor directly across his decaying jaw. There was no crack of human bone, only the hollow, sickening sound of a shattered vinyl record. A thick, black liquid exactly like printers. Ink heavily oozed from the open wound. He didn't flinch. Instead, the 1,000 platform gramophones unleashed a synchronized, agonizingly high-pitched screech that forced me to my bleeding knees. Hot needles pierced my eardrums. "We strictly forbid violence," the brass chorus vibrated. "We only accept the final recording." I frantically scrambled toward the carriage where I saw Jackson trapped. The heavy door was still open, exhaling that freezing, ozone-scented mist. I stepped inside. The temperature instantly plummeted to freezing. The decaying interior was lined with rotting red velvet and black mahogany wood. Jackson slumped in the corner, his skin exactly as pale as the dead conductor's. The cruel brass tube lodged in his throat throbbed, glowing a sickly green every time he weakly breathed. "Jackson, wake up," I desperately shouted, violently shaking him. Jackson's dead eyes slowly rolled toward me, heavily clouded with a thick, milky film. He painfully opened his mouth, but zero sound escaped his ruined throat. Instead, a rusted gramophone spoke. "Marcus, you shouldn't have come here. This isn't a train. It's a massive lung, running out of air." Suddenly, the floor violently shifted. The ghostly train began moving not forward, but plunging downward, tilting at an impossible angle into the Earth's black throat. The nightmare conductor abruptly entered the carriage. His jerky, horrifying stop-motion movements made him look like a broken glitch in reality. He slowly extended a long, razor-sharp silver needle attached to a black cylinder. "The dark archive requires a fresh voice for the final track," the wall gramophone chillingly whispered. "The zero line approaches the grand gallery of echoes. You will be our soloist." Panicking, I backed into the narrow corridor, desperately hunting for any weapon to sever Jackson's glowing brass connection. I spotted a heavy fire axe behind a glass pane chillingly labeled, "In case of silence." I violently smashed the glass. The shattering noise was instantly caught and weaponized by the train's acoustics, loudly echoing 100 times. I viciously swung the axe directly at Jackson's glowing brass tube. As the heavy steel sliced through the metal, an unforgettable, horrifying sound erupted. It wasn't a mechanical snap. It was a trapped human scream, finally violently set free. The entire train shrieked back, its fleshy leather boiler throbbing wildly. Jackson heavily slumped forward, the sickly green glow slowly fading from his empty eyes. He was finally breathing on his own, but dangerously weak. "Run, Marcus, the conductor. He's just a needle," Jackson weakly wheezed. I stared at the conductor, his paper-thin skin violently ripped apart, revealing a terrifying, complex internal skeleton built entirely of rapid spinning gears and vibrating needles. He wasn't a human ghost. He was a biological phonograph, explicitly designed to harvest the horrific frequencies of human suffering. The train abruptly plunged into a massive, pitch-black cavern. My flashlight beam couldn't even reach the towering ceiling. This was the terrifying Grand Gallery of Echoes. The endless cavern walls were constructed from millions of human skulls, their jaws forced open and violently fitted with small brass resonators. Every single sound ever made in the city above was captured here, refined, and directly fed into the roaring engine. I finally saw the master record, a massive black disc, the exact size of a city block, slowly spinning. "You are ruining the symphony." The mechanical conductor's voice loudly boomed, sounding exactly like a demonic, distorted opera singer. He violently lunged, his fingers instantly extending into long, razor-sharp styluses. I barely dodged his deadly strike, the needles burying themselves deep into the heavy mahogany wood. I forcefully grabbed Jackson's arm, desperately dragging him toward the back emergency exit. The cursed zero line was rapidly accelerating, the violent friction on the rusted tracks creating a blinding shower of blue sparks illuminating the terrifying sea of skulls. We reached the rear platform. The rushing wind smelled like ancient dust and rotting copper. I looked at the tracks behind us. They were vanishing. The zero line literally didn't exist behind the moving train. It was violently created by our sound and erased instantly as we passed. If we jumped, we'd plummet into the abyss's infinite silence. "We have to jump into the echoes," I desperately screamed to Jackson. "The skulls, they trap the sound. They're entirely solid." Jackson stared at the swirling darkness, then back at the nightmare conductor tearing through the heavy carriage door, his mechanical body violently unfolding into a terrifying web of sharp needles and rusted wires. We had zero choice. I gripped Jackson's pale hand, took a deep breath, and leaped from the moving train toward the wall of skulls. As we plummeted, the train unleashed one final, deafening whistler, flawless, horrifying recording of my dead mother screaming my name. The terrifying fall felt like an absolute eternity. The wind didn't just whistle past my ears. It chillingly whispered dark secrets in forgotten voices I hadn't heard since childhood. We violently slammed into the skull wall, but the impact was shockingly soft. The grand gallery of echoes was glued together by a thick, translucent resin feeling like dried blood. I desperately dug my bleeding fingers deep into the empty eye sockets, tightly anchoring myself. Jackson dangled helplessly below me, his breathing reduced to ragged, metallic gasps. Above us, the cursed train continued its descent, an orange streak disappearing forever. "Don't. Absolutely don't listen to them, Marcus," Jackson weakly wheezed, his terrified eyes locked on the endless skulls. I instantly realized his warning. The skulls weren't just dead bone, they were active resonators. Every single one violently vibrated with a completely different frequency. One played a bustling Victorian marketplace, another broadcasted a secret, modern-day office conversation. It was a crippling, sensory overload, a tidal wave of stolen lives. If I listened too closely, my own mind would be permanently overwritten. We aggressively began the terrifying climb, a vertical mile of shattered bone and rusted brass. Every few minutes, a resonator randomly activated, violently blasting sounds so loud it shook the entire foundation. I spotted lost 1920s explorers physically fused into the bone wall, pith helmets intact, their screaming mouths violently fitted with large copper funnels. They weren't dead. Their terrified eyes directly tracked our climb. They were infrastructure now living, biological amplifiers designed to broadcast the city's endless grief. "Look up there." Jackson desperately pointed at a faint flickering blue light 500 feet above. It wasn't the sickly train orange or the glowing gramophone green. It was the sterile, beautiful fluorescent blue of the modern London Underground. We were finally nearing a leak where the Nightmare Zero line directly touched reality. But blocking our only escape was a massive, horizontal iron beam. and menacingly perched directly on it was the terrifying, fully transformed Silent Conductor. The Conductor had completely shed his fake human skin. He was now a towering, nightmarish spire of violently spinning brass cylinders and long, skeletal needles. He moved exactly like a giant clockwork spider. His sharp needles rhythmically clicked against the iron beam, broadcasting a deadly code echoing through the massive gallery. "Return to your assigned seats," the millions of skulls forcefully whispered in a terrifying, polyphonic harmony. "The dark recording isn't finished. You are the final verse." The spider conductor violently lunged, his razor-sharp needles shattering the skull wall mere inches from my skull. The heavy impact released a deafening burst of trapped screams that nearly knocked me unconscious. I forcefully grabbed Jackson's arm, desperately swinging him toward a rusted maintenance ladder bolted to the iron beam. "Climb, Jackson. Never look down." I ripped out my tactical knife, my absolute last weapon, and violently jammed it directly into the conductor's central spinning gear, housing blinding blue sparks violently erupted as steel ground heavily against ancient brass. The conductor unleashed a horrific sound, like an entire symphony played at 10 times its normal speed. His needles flailed wildly, forcefully stitching my heavy jacket directly to the bone wall. Searing friction heat burned as the internal gears rapidly melted. The archive cannot be silenced. The skulls deafeningly roared. I viciously kicked the main cylinder with everything I had, snapping the mechanical head back and freeing myself. I desperately scrambled up the ladder right behind Jackson. The fluorescent blue light was completely blinding now. We vividly heard the muffled, beautiful sounds of a modern tube train screeching brakes, the automated voice calmly announcing, "Please mind the gap." It was absolute heaven. But the dimensional gap between the nightmare zero line and reality was rapidly closing. The heavy lead seal I broke earlier was aggressively melting, trying to forcefully refuse itself to permanently close the breach. We finally reached a small, circular maintenance hatch in the ceiling. I aggressively pushed, but it was held completely shut by 100 years of pressurized silence. Directly below us, the conductor was violently rebuilding himself, his spinning needles gathering loose bone and brass into a new, massive clockwork body. He was rising like a terrifying metal tide. Together, Jackson pushed. We slammed our heavy shoulders against the hatch and loudly screamed, not in fear, but pure, raw defiance. The heavy hatch finally gave way with a deafening thunderclap. We violently tumbled through, crashing onto the dirty, tiled floor of a modern maintenance room. I instantly slammed the hatch shut, desperately dragging a massive electrical transformer over it. The dark room went completely silent. Zero whispers, zero gramophones, just the comforting hum of a nearby vending machine. I quickly checked Jackson. He shivered violently, his ruined throat heavily scarred. I grabbed my phone to dial emergency services, but there was absolutely no signal. Just a single unauthorized audio file sitting there. The terrifying file name read, Marcus_finale.mp3. I froze, staring at my cracked screen. My thumb slowly hovered over the play button, but Jackson violently grabbed my wrist. His desperate grip was shockingly strong, his pale skin feeling like freezing parchment. "Don't do it," he painfully whispered, his ruined voice violently cracking. "If you play that file, you instantly complete the circuit. The zero line doesn't just want our voices anymore. It wants a massive broadcast." I slowly looked at the sealed hatch. It was violently vibrating, a deep hum rattling the floor tiles. We weakly stumbled out of the dark room, directly into the bright main corridor of Angel Station. 11:30 p.m. A few tired commuters were scattered across the platform, mindlessly scrolling phones, completely oblivious that 7 miles of haunted brass and shattered bone lay directly beneath their feet. A violent wave of nausea hit me. To them, reality felt totally solid. To me, the entire world was just a fragile crust hiding a boiling soup of human screams. Every single noise they blindly made was being actively harvested below. Suddenly, the modern PA system violently crackled to life. It absolutely didn't announce a standard train delay. It violently blasted a sharp burst of static, followed by the terrifying, distinct sound of a heavy Victorian needle hitting a dusty wax cylinder. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The distracted commuters didn't notice. But then, the automated voice completely shifted. It wasn't the calm announcer anymore. It was the polyphonic, demonic roar of 1,000 dead skulls. Next train, St. Jude's for the silent. Please mind the gap in your soul. Jackson heavily collapsed against a glass vending machine. His ruined neck was violently glowing against that sickly, toxic green light rapidly pulsing directly beneath his skin. It's actively calling me back, he painfully gasped. I'm physically still on those tracks, Marcus. I never actually left the carriage. I stared at him in absolute horror. His reflection in the dark glass wasn't human anymore. It was a terrifying silhouette built entirely of rusted copper wire and spinning gears. You don't just walk away from the zero line. Once recorded, you belong forever. A real train slowly pulled into the bright station. The standard black and yellow northern line. The heavy doors slid open. But peering inside, those passengers definitely weren't modern commuters. They sat perfectly, unnaturally still, hands locked in their laps, their decaying faces the exact color of old newspaper. One slowly looked up. It was the nightmare Silent Conductor, mocking me by wearing a modern yellow transit vest over his ticking, gear-filled chest. He slowly pointed a razor-sharp needle finger directly at my face. The PA system deafeningly shrieked, "Ticket, please." The regular commuters completely failed to see the monsters. They just blindly saw an empty late-night train. They literally began stepping inside, physically walking right through the terrifying ghostly forms of the Victorian dead. "Stop. Do not get on," I frantically yelled, but my own voice was instantly hijacked by the acoustics, violently twisted into a screeching train whistle. The Nightmare Zero line was actively overlapping with the real world. A deadly digital and physical parasite, aggressively merging with London's pulse. I desperately stared at my phone. The file Marcus_finale.mp3 hit play entirely on its own. The volume bar violently maxed out, but the audio wasn't my stolen voice. It broadcasted the screeching friction of the conductor's violently shattered gears. A corrupted acoustic virus. It was pure, discordant chaos, violently grinding metal on metal. As the horrific sound rapidly echoed through the station, the ghostly train violently flickered out of reality. The conductor unleashed a distorted shriek, vibrating out of control until his brass cylinders literally exploded. "Jackson, give me your hand now." I violently grabbed him, sprinting blindly toward the broken escalator. The acoustic virus from my phone acted like a localized sonic EMP, violently blowing out station lights and heavily shattering the glass advertisement boards. The Zero line was rapidly retreating, the Grand Gallery violently pushed back down by the sheer chaotic violence of the corrupted recording. We desperately reached the surface, bursting onto the dark London streets. That freezing night air never felt so incredible. I blindly took my cursed phone and hurled it with every ounce of strength directly into a nearby construction site's active concrete mixer. I silently watched it permanently sink into the thick grey sludge. The sickening vibration in my teeth finally ceased. Jackson heavily collapsed to his knees, that toxic green glow slowly fading into a dark, permanent scar. We were finally back, but the massive city sounded totally different now. I absolutely couldn't hear the wind anymore. I only heard the terrifying, endless friction of millions of lives being secretly recorded. Jackson now lives in a remote cabin, miles from any machinery. I stayed in London, but I will absolutely never set foot underground again. I walk everywhere, but the city isn't safe. Sometimes, standing over a dark subway grate on a quiet street, I don't hear the normal trains. I hear the slow, terrifying, rhythmic scratching of a heavy needle on a wax cylinder. Just beneath the concrete, the zero line is still running. It's just patiently waiting for the city to quiet down so it can finish recording my final song. The end.